Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Couple of Nukes. As always, I'm your host, Mr. Whiskey, and we've briefly touched upon chronic illness before because sometimes it just shows up out of nowhere. Sometimes it's from a physical accident, sometimes it's genetic, and it's something that we don't think about at all unless we have it or know someone who does have it. But even if we know someone who have it, we don't fully understand the depth of what living with that is like. So I am definitely honored to be having this conversation today to get into the physical and mental tolls of living with a chronic illness. While there are many different types, there are some universal effects and lessons that we'll be getting into. We're here with an expert on the subject, Dr. Jeffery Bone, who is a podcaster, author, and of course has personal experience with this subject. So we'll be getting into that conversation today. And Dr. Bone, so great to have you here.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I look forward to it.
So can you just tell us just a little bit of a brief overview? Obviously, we'll get into the nitty and gritty details of your life here shortly, but just a brief overview of kind of what got you into this, what you do now, and then we'll, go back from there.
Sure. I've been in that mental health space with chronic illness for over 2 decades. And I guess the universe decided I really needed to upgrade my knowledge. So about a decade ago, it gave me a chronic illness. So I was actually specialized in terms of treating that space of chronic illness, chronic pain. And then I leveled up to developing my own chronic illness, my own chronic pain, so I could learn that much more. So right now, I'm a chronic illness coach, mentor. And like you said, I write books, I have my own podcast, and that's where I come from.
Mm. Right. As you, I am glad to hear you seem to have a pretty positive spin on it. Some people would call it a, cruel irony or ironically fitting. And
Yes.
you seem to, understand the mindset of, well, we have it now and let's use it to the best of our abilities to help others. So I definitely respect and
Oh,
appreciate that.
absolutely. But that being said, it's kind of like I had my tears, I've had my
Right, right.
sadness, I've had my anxiety. I'm a human before, any of my education or background. And
100%.
so, I step into talking to you today with 10 years of, coping and dealing with it and being on the other side of the emotional storm and being able to leverage my experience to be able to assist others, to be able to find a creative voice within myself, and to leverage it the best I possibly can. I could sit here and cry and talk about how I'm a victim to unfortunate circumstances, but that doesn't really level up the quality of my life. And when you have a chronic illness, you very much want to caretake your quality of life any which way.
100%. So before we get into that deeper dive of chronic illness, all that, let's go back to what got you into that space to begin with, especially on the mental health side, kind of educational background, personal interest growing
Sure.
up and all that.
It was a junior year in high school. It was an elective course on psychology. And I just found it to be interesting. You're in high school, you're taking all these classes, English, history, science, math,
Right.
and it's kind of like, man, I have to pick one of these and I have to write it out for my life. These classes kind of suck. I'm not too interested in this. I'm not too thrilled. Maybe I'll be a PE coach or something. But I came across that psychology class, and it was just simply this: I would like to know more about this. This is interesting. I'd like to know. So you go to college and 4 years and have all different kinds of classes within psychology. I'm like, okay, that was interesting. I would like to know more about that. So I get my master's, then I get my doctorate, and even after my doctorate, trust me, I still needed to learn more. There was still more. The world of chronic illness, chronic pain, they didn't teach that, getting my master's, getting my doctorate. That was not something that they specialized in. And so that's where I had to find it on my own, being curious, looking. One of the best sources of knowledge on it, talking to patients, talking about what their experiences have been, but also the courses, also the extra courses, the continuing education, the podcasts, the books, all those different things, and talking to some of my fellow peers to be able to collect more information because the learning never ever stops.
Right. And so from that journey of psychology to now I'm specifically interested in the chronic illness side of it, what kind of career unfolded for you? Was it more, nonprofit community work, or was it going into having a clinic? What did that look like?
It looked like one-on-one practice. And
Mhm.
I've been one of those guys that I've always enjoyed just working for myself. I have worked in medical offices before, in orthopedic offices,
Right.
in small little group practices, but I've always really liked working, one-on-one with people. And when it came to the pandemic, you know what? It's like all of a sudden, like everyone in the world was perfectly fine. Everyone was cool with just doing it video conference style, doing it on Zoom or a phone call. And I found like I didn't have to pay for the overhead. And it's like, okay, well, I can do that. And it's like, well, I have this podcast. This podcast reaches all around the world, all over the United States, and I can see anyone around the world or in the United States through the platform of chronic illness coaching. And so, one on one chronic illness coaching has been my focus.
And so you mentioned the podcast sounds like it was started pretty early on in what you were doing. What kind of inspired you to do the podcast?
I really have, like I said, I've always been a learner. I've always been curious, and podcasts have always been a great source of information. I've always liked audiobooks, and I've always liked just sitting and listening to stories. And so I'm more of this audio kind of
Right.
oriented individual. And I found like, wow, this is great. This is great. And it's like, then there was just this little moment where I'm like, well, I wonder if I could do this. And not that I'm going to have all these sponsors and not that I'm going to have all these affiliated links, but I just wonder if I could kind of broadcast my voice, kind of like a ham radio style. Just kind of like, I wonder if I can make it really easy. I could put it on GarageBand, make an MP3, upload it to Apple and Spotify, and just roll with it. And lo and behold, I could,
Right.
and the only investment I really made was into this Shure mic that I have. And it was kind of like, I like that kind of stuff. The low overhead, don't have to invest too much capital, and I could run with it. I did that with the books. The chronic illness workbook, the poetry books, the other books that I wrote, and the coloring books. I just put it out through Kindle Direct Publishing, and it's incredibly free. And so all I need to do is create these PDFs, upload the PDFs, go to ChatGPT, make a cover, and lo and behold, there I have it. And so it just shows it just needs a little bit of creativity. You need a little bit of curiosity. You don't need $10,000 to put out a book, to put out a podcast.
Right. And when you first started podcasting, what was kind of the goal? Just each episode would be a lesson related to chronic illness.
It was an experience that I could learn alongside with my listeners,
Mm.
because I've always liked learning. So, like, well, why don't I read these books and try to gather some information about this stuff, and then. And this is kind of funny because I've always been afraid of public speaking. That throughout all of my education, public
Mm.
speaking was my Achilles heel. And so I was always super anxious. And which is also why I was interested in psychology, because I wanted to understand that. And so I was like, oh, I could learn about this book. I could learn about this philosophy. I could learn about this, and then I could share it, because the best way to learn it is to be able to teach it.
Right.
And I
Right.
never thought I would be a good teacher in the traditional sense of having to manage a classroom. But I thought, I'm kind of a guest lecturer to your life. If you're so interested, you can look up my podcast, and
Right.
there I am, the guest lecturer.
Right. And now you've been doing that for how long?
I've been doing that for a few years, and I've been more consistent with it lately. And there isn't necessarily always a perfect time frame. Sometimes I put out, multiple ones in a week, and sometimes I'll go 2 or 3 weeks and not make one. So the consistency is kind of hit and miss depending on life, depending on my own illness. But I've been more consistent with it over the past few years. And I think it was actually Dave Asprey's kind of bulletproof. podcasts, into the biohacking world. I think that's where I kind of started. And I just found it interesting. Ben Greenfield, Dave Asprey, that's where I kind of started, listening to podcasts on a regular basis. And partly I was moving in that direction because I was dealing with an illness and I was looking for answers, looking for something outside the mainstream because the mainstream wasn't giving me any particular answers that was helpful at that time.
Mm,
So that's where I went into the biohacking world. Oddly enough, Dave Asprey also, became ill from mold as well, and so there was a little bit of extra interest in that direction. He has some idiosyncratic aspects to who he is, and he's the salesman through and through. But the ability to kind of share stories and help people was kind of inspiring to me.
right. So before we move on, I'd love to share the name of that podcast, of course, and who should tune into that.
To the Bone, conversations on pain, illness, and meaning. That is my podcast, To the Bone.
Hmm. No
Obviously, a
name
play on
pun
the word
intended.
on my
Yeah, I
name,
was gonna say, yeah.
Bone.
Right. But and to the degree that sometimes chronic illness, that's how deeply it physically and mentally penetrates you. So I think that's
Oh,
great,
it
of
does
course.
cut to
It's
the
probably
bone.
beyond that, And so
Yes, through
we'll
the
we'll be
soul.
getting into that, which is actually where I want to go next. You
Sure.
talked about developing a chronic illness. So let's kind of talk about that journey, especially how it
Oh, yeah.
started and, the first year or two, I imagine, are the worst possibly.
Oh, because it's the most frightening, the most uncertain, and you're doing everything you can to get back to the old self. Because I was in the office, I developed this headache, and this headache just would not go away. And I ended up getting referred to an ENT. The ENT gives me Flonase, which is nasal steroids,
Mm,
and prednisone. Really kind of common stuff, nothing too wild. But when I took the prednisone, my body flipped out. I
mm.
became, I had vibrating feet, horrible fatigue, bladder pain.
Wow.
I felt like I had a concussion. I had a tremor. I had all these things going on. I was a different person through and through, and I wasn't getting better. I'd go to all the doctors, and they're like, "Oh yeah, just give it a few days, you'll be fine. Give it a week, you'll be fine. Give it a month, you'll be
Hmm.
fine." And the time went by, and I was not fine. Something was seriously wrong with me. And I go through all the traditional doctors. I see neurologists, internists, other ENTs. I have a sinus surgery. I see a urologist. I see all these different people. They're all failing me, and I tell them it's systemic. It's yeah, you're looking at this one body part, but it's from head to toe. I have issues. I have a
Hmm.
headache, that has not gone away, and I had a headache. Still have it even a decade later, but it's much more faint. But I had a strong, strong headache for every single day for 2 years at least, and so I'm trying everything, 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 and I end up going to a functional medicine doctor because the traditional route is just not serving me. And he does some blood work and says, you know what, you may have a mold issue. And so I do a urinalysis, mycotoxins, the problematic element of mold. I had all of them, and so everything that could be tested was tested in an abnormal range, and so that was problematic. And I tested my office. I had environmentalists come in, and there was two different neurotoxin molds in my HVAC. It was a building that was turned over in bankruptcy a few
Mm.
times, and it just wasn't very well maintained. Well, it kind of destroyed my life in many ways, unfortunately.
Right.
And so I treated with that doctor for about a year, and I got better, but it was never better. It was like I had no good days. And so I was going to go to the Mayo Clinic. And it's like, well, before I do that, I have some good hospital systems by me. So let me look at the hospital directory and let me see, is there anyone else that I can go talk to? And so I picked toxicology. I had no idea what toxicology even did, but I felt toxic. So I went there, and he was a nice gentleman. He didn't believe the whole mold thing. I'm like, I don't care. I don't care. What do you think's going on? So he took me seriously, and he tested my immunoglobulins and they came back clinically low. So part of my immune system wasn't working very well. So I
Mm,
got sent to an immunologist, and the immunologist gives me a vaccine. And then a month later, she tests my blood to see if I made antibodies to the vaccine. Well, guess what? I didn't make any antibodies to the vaccine. And with the low immunoglobulins, that means I have common variable immune deficiency. And so I have to do weekly infusions where I put needles into my stomach to be able to infuse immunoglobulins. And a lot of people don't know what immunoglobulins are, but they know about plasma donation. People donate
mm,
plasma,
mm.
people donate blood. Well, when they donate plasma, well, they make immunoglobulins from that. And so, thank you, one and all who are out there donating plasma.
Because you are still getting that correct, or that was just
It
for
will
a
be for the
trial
rest of my
period?
life.
Wow.
Yes, yes. And so it's yeah, it is. So I get infections all the time, sinus
Mm,
infections, eye infections, different infections, low grade kind of fatigue all the time. I have allergies, and through all this, I developed even like years later, I developed like all these other like strange allergies, food allergies. And so I have just like this haywire body, and sometimes it doesn't stay the same.
mm.
And so, like, oh, well, I guess you're allergic to dairy and eggs and wheat now. Well, good luck with that. And so it's kind of like, it's just, what my immune system does. And so it doesn't like to stay put. But I will be infusing immunoglobulins. And after we get done talking, I have to go and infuse some
Right.
immunoglobulins. And you get used to it. It's not the most fun thing in the entire world. I did not think that I was going to grow up and have to stick needles into my sides for the rest of my life. But the alternative is dying. And so it's kind of like I'll take it
Right.
over the alternative.
Right. I'll circle back to one thing you said in an episode of my podcast, Beyond Symptom Management, Functional Medicine, Faith, and True Healing. What we spoke about with Dr. Mark Shearwood was actually about looking at the whole system. And what we talked about is how
Yes.
so many people will only look at one part or one symptom, and the body is a complex system. I mean,
Big,
it's
yes.
all kinds of interwired systems. And so we talked about how sometimes when you isolate too much, you're not looking at other things that are being affected or that could be factors. And so we talked about how important it is. One thing that you've clearly done that we talk about as well is we are our own number one health advocate. Nobody cares about your health
Yes.
more than you do. And going to multiple doctors is always advised. Having a
Always.
degree doesn't make you always right, and
Nope.
different
Or
types of
believed.
doctors. Yeah. And unfortunately, I've had a lot of horror stories on the show or talking to people in my personal life of doctors who said something was fine, the patient believes them and comes back, and now it's an irreversible issue. Or
Yes.
some people who have even passed away because of something that went undetected, both
Oh,
especially
medical
military
mistakes.
side and civilian side, but especially
Yes.
military side. Uh,
No, the VA is difficult. VA is very, very
yeah,
difficult. And I know through the system and everything I've gone through, like I couldn't sleep, and I didn't know why I couldn't sleep. And they were throwing all these different medications at me. I did multiple sleep studies. I go talk to like the head of sleep medicine and all that kind of stuff. And it really wasn't until I went to the functional medicine doctor, he tested my cortisol through saliva throughout the entire day, and it showed my cortisol was significantly elevated. Well, then I started taking adaptogens to bring down that cortisol, and then I was able to finally sleep. So the traditional allopathic, and I'm not against Western medicine, they save lives, they do everything, but they
right.
don't do everything. They don't look at everything. And so that was one thing where it's just like I needed to bring down my cortisol. And another one was I would go and they're like, oh yeah, you have really high homocysteine. Well, that's not good. And so I did further testing. It shows that I have the MTHFR gene, and so I have to use methylated B vitamins to bring down that homocysteine.
Mm,
The other doctors would just go, "Well, yeah, that's pretty high," and then they would carry on, and they wouldn't look at the system. They wouldn't look at the big picture. They wouldn't look at easy interventions, whether it's an adaptogen, whether it's a methylated B vitamin, of being able to make the body work better.
right. And I will say it's probably hard to have low cortisol when you have chronic illness. I mean, you're pretty stressed out physically and mentally quite often
Yes.
besides everything else going on in your body, especially a
Yes.
body that is declining or ever changing. And so one thing we mentioned there, so you talked about mold exposure, specifically toxic
Yes.
mold exposure. How does that work in terms of was there something in the mold that destroyed your immune system? Or for those of us who aren't familiar with the science, could you break that down for us?
Sure. Well, at the end of the day, about 25% of people have a gene. I think it's called the HLA gene. And those people cannot clear the mycotoxins out of the system. And it just kind of recycles within the
Mm,
system. And so you could have, let's just say there's 10 people in a room. Well, eight of them could be perfectly fine, and two of them could get extremely ill. And everyone would say, well, we're fine, this must be just psychosomatic. And
mm,
what you end up getting is this recycling of these inflammatory cascades, which then creates this condition called chronic inflammatory response syndrome,
right.
which basically is everything is on fire from head to toe. And I have nerve pain from it that never went away. I still have nerve pain in my head that never went away. And oddly enough, a long time ago, I had a SPECT scan. And a SPECT scan, I don't know if you know Dr. Daniel Amen, but it looks at like overactive and underactive parts of the brain based on
Mm,
blood flow.
okay.
And I then got one after all of this mold stuff, and you could see the dramatic change in my brain. My brain looked like Swiss cheese after. It didn't
Mm,
mean that there were holes. It mean that there were just low levels of blood profusion in parts
right.
of my brain that should have been more active. And it was very damaged by this, basically the cytokine storm that occurred, with all of the inflammation.
Wow. But yeah, I think a lot of us listening probably were like, oh man, mold just like poisons, but you're saying there's a
For
pre-existing
some
gene
people. And so,
factor on top of it. Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
regardless, you should try to keep mold out of all your spaces. I don't care whether you're immune to it or not. It's not a good
yes.
thing to have in your life, but that is an important fact to denote there. And so you spent a long time trying to get help. And then, you spent a lot of time working in this space beforehand with people suffering from chronic illness. Did a lot of them kind of share a similar experience of not being able to get the medical help that they needed, or it just being a difficult, long journey of multiple doctors, of not being able to pinpoint what was wrong?
Most people, have kind of like these traditional paths. They may have arthritis, they may have lupus, where it's kind of like, oh, we can see the, blood marker called ANA. You can
Mm,
see that there's this autoimmune, element going on in the body matched up to certain symptoms. Is kind of like pretty straightforward. But there would be a lot of people, and more than just a few, where they just didn't fit the traditional decision tree. So you go see the doctor, like, do you have a fever? Do you have this? Do you have these symptoms or these symptoms? They're asking you their decision tree of what they think the problem is. And some of these people just wouldn't fit into these decision trees.
mm,
And they would end up with more esoteric illnesses, and they would have to do more genetic testing, or they would have to go to the specialist and hope that the person that they were talking to would be able to understand it. They would end up with connective tissue disorders like Ehlers-Danlos. They would end up with other things that were just not the run of the mill, like lower back pain, sciatic pain, and sometimes you would be very severe, cases like CRPS, chronic regional pain syndrome. A lot of times, like people would walk in, I could see their hand. I'm like, oh, it looks like you have CRPS, and they're like, how do you know that? It's like, yeah, it's painfully out. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so not everyone fits into that same, place. And there are other conditions like fibromyalgia. I've come across medical doctors that just they don't believe it exists. It exists,
mm.
it absolutely exists. But they were stubborn in thinking like, oh, you know what, it's just hysterical women or something of that nature. They would be just misogynistic with it. No, it's just the nature of the illness, and just because it doesn't have a clear, diagnostic pathway where you can just do this clear blood work for it, and they're working on that, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist when it clearly does.
For sure. I think, what I've learned studying the human body and nature is that there are just some things that can't be fully explained or that are just yet to be explained. And I think, it is surprising some of the new developments we continually discover or find, not even of our own accord. Sometimes we just find new rare genetic cases or changes in the body. And so I think you, it's important to be structured and factual as a scientist or a doctor, but also there's an
Sure.
element of open-mindedness to it that you have to have. I mean, that's just, my opinion on it, of course, but I think that's
Oh
really
yeah,
important.
absolutely. And the thing is, we're learning all these different things. I always like the example of the restless leg syndrome, where
Mhm.
people just refuse to believe, oh, it's not real, it's not real. They came out with a medication for it, and it's like, yeah, all these people are diagnosed with restless leg syndrome. But like, okay, now that we have a medication, we'll recognize your disorder. But prior to the medication, it would be ultimately dismissed. And then there's things that are always occurring that they're, someone was just telling me now, there's a study that came out that showed this cerebral spine fluid was like leaking into the lymphatic drainage system, and they were thinking that like that is
Mm.
actually contributing to a lot of autoimmune conditions. I haven't read anything up on it, someone was just telling me about this, but that's just another example of like, oh, like we've come across this new thing, we have this new understanding. But there's never that when you're talking to the doctor. When you're talking to some doctors, not all doctors, some doctors, they have this arrogance of whatever I know is all that could exist. And if I don't possess it as knowledge in my mind, then therefore it's not going to be acknowledged as a real condition or diagnosis with me. And so I think that's just so small-minded of people. And
It
yes, I don't
affects
believe that we should just
lives.
make up things, left and right. But at the same time, we should be patient, listen, and be good medical detectives to be able to figure out what could be kind of going on. And I just see that people just fall into they fall out of the decision tree. And then once they do that, it's like, oh, go see the psych, go see the mental
Right.
health, go, it must be that. And it's like, there's so many other things that it could be, but they don't bother to look. Like
Right. 100%.
I went through all my medical crisis for multiple years and not one medical doctor, and I'm telling them it's systemic. Not one person ever said, well, have you ever seen an immunologist? Maybe it's your immune system. Not one ever
Wow.
did. It's kind of like it was
Wow.
never suggested, and I just didn't follow up on it. It was never suggested. I didn't know what an immunologist was. And so it's kind of, they're like super allergists. They're allergists, but then they're like the really, really smart, leveled up
Right.
allergists. And so, and they well versed on the immune system. And so it's kind of like, there's just a lack of humility. I don't expect every doctor to know everything.
Right.
That's perfectly fine. But so many times the doctor would want to just have an answer and they wouldn't just say, I don't know. He's like, let me refer you to somebody else. I don't know. It's like so many doctors, they clearly didn't know at the end of the day. And they use what I call the swag technique. It's the
Mm.
scientific wild ass guess. And so they were just throwing that out. And it just wasn't helpful. The scientific wild ass guess is not helpful. What is helpful is, I don't know. Let me refer you to somebody. That is helpful. And so, and if some doctor said, "Oh man, I just don't know," it's kind of like, you know what? I appreciate the honesty. It's kind of like, here, let's problem solve who would be a good person to refer to and what specialty that should be. And it's
Yeah.
like, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's still useful information to me. But if you get me going on a wild, chase, for some sort of like, oh, it's this medication, that medication, or this, and that, and it's kind of like just because you're just throwing things off the cuff, that's not helpful. That's not helpful at all.
Not only that, but that chase requires time. And for some of these illnesses or, things happening with our body, that time is further development of more irreversibleness. I mean,
Yes.
that's how it is. Some of these things are a chase against time. Now, speaking of resources, besides other doctors and podcasts. You've also, created a couple books. So I'd love to go over those, starting with the very first one you made.
The first one I made was I think it's called Broken Bone, which is my poetry book. And I was just sitting and I wish I could paint. I wish I could sculpt. I wish I could like carve things out of wood, or I just don't have that spatial skill. It's just, it was not a gift that was provided to me in this world, but I could speak in like short, fragmented, ideas, and short, fragmented ideas were perfect for poetry. So I just started writing poems as a way of kind of journaling my own experience, journaling my own thoughts, journaling my own feelings. I look back on them now and it's just like, oh, like, it's like, I don't know always about that. But at that moment, it was very cathartic, which is it was a great emotional release. And that's what I was looking for. Anything that I've created, I've ultimately created for myself, because it was out of something that I needed and I made it, come into this world. And at first, it was broken bone. Then the second one was carved out of bone. As you can see, I like to play off of my name, and there were just ways of being able to be creative. Because when you're sick and you're ill and things just aren't going the way you want to, and you feel really lost, finding curiosity in your life will really serve you. Being curious about something, being curious about the world around you, what you could do with whatever strengths and whatever gifts that you have, because that is focusing on the control that you have in this world. And the illness and the difficulty of the illness is so much of the out of control aspects, that you can't control the pain, you can't control the fatigue, you can't control these allergic reactions, but I can control this verse, I can control this rhyme, I can control these different things. And that didn't just like make everything magically better, but it gave me something that I could kind of rest my mind on. And it made a difference in improving the quality of my life on an emotional basis.
Right. And now is that kind of what led you into the doorway of creating all these nonfiction books for, helping people? Was that kind of like an inspiration to it, or did someone tell you, hey, you should write a
Yes.
book, or what was kind of the process?
It was the curiosity. It was moving towards the obstacles. It's like Ryan Holiday has a book called The Obstacle's the Way, and looking for like what would be an obstacle. Like, oh, I've never put together a coloring book, let me see if I can do that. So I did three of them. Let me see if I can put together a chronic illness journal so people could, be prompted to write things, and they could just kind of write on their own, and instead of just staring at a blank piece of paper. And so I made two of those. And then I got like, oh, like, the prose, the traditional book of someone's like, oh, I have a book. Like what you're expecting. You're not expecting, oh, I have a book. And then you hand them a coloring book. It's like, that's not what they're expecting. They're expecting the traditional prose. And so, and I wrote two, specifically about burnout. And one is just more of a general burnout, and then one is just called, the restless human, and then there's one called the restless waiting room, which is much more of the medical side of the burnout, because that's something that isn't talked about. Because people will say like, oh yeah, the person's depressed, the person's anxious, but there's a lot of subclinical suffering in that realm of, burnout, all the appointments, all the medications, all the pharmacy, all the this, all the
Hmm.
that. And when you're chronically sick, you never leave the treadmill. You're always on the treadmill. It's like, oh, it's been 4 hours. I need to take this medication. I need to take these supplements. I need to do this. I need to follow up with that appointment. I need to get that authorization. I need to go do this. I need to go do that. Chronic illness is always a part of that story. And just having pain itself, as I'm sitting here, I have pain in my head, pain in my foot, and it's always there. It's always kind of distracting. And the burnout is real. And so oftentimes when I say medical burnout, people will think, oh, yeah, 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 the doctors really have it tough. And they do. But the medical burnout I'm talking about is the burnout for patients. And it's not always, and what I found most of the time, it's not about like depression, anxiety. It could be worry and sadness. It's not everything that just needs a pill. I'm not anti-pills. I'm not antidepressants, but not everyone needs them. And that there are other alternatives that they do need to be able to find a little bit more peace of mind.
Right. And then you also wrote Mold Brain and Chemical Undertow. Can you tell us a little bit about those books?
Mold brain just came from wanting some sort of acknowledgement to the greater world that mycotoxins and mold can greatly impact your brain. The anxiety, the attention, the concentration, the depression, the insomnia, it becomes this inflammatory bomb to the brain.
Mm,
And part of it is more than anything, it's the acknowledgement that this is real, that this is a thing, that this is important, that this is not paid attention to, because people can be living. They talk about all the time where people that have this mold illness, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, they get in fights all the time with their partner. It's like they're more likely to get divorced. They're more likely to lose their job. They're more like, and again, yes, because their brain is on fire. And it's like, if people can appreciate the inflammation that is occurring because of the mycotoxin, that they can show these individuals more grace. They can be more patient with these people. When my brain was ill, at the worst of the worst, couldn't remember my kids' names. The dog was sitting there, couldn't remember the dog's name. It's like I couldn't remember anything. And so I couldn't watch TV because the motion on the TV would make me nauseous. During Christmas time, the Christmas lights and the movements like would
mm,
make me nauseous. I'd have to turn away.
yeah.
I couldn't even look at my phone because I couldn't stand the motion of it because it was like I had this concussion. And I just read books. I wouldn't remember anything, but that was my place of distraction. It was just reading books because my brain was so inflamed. And so it was like this entry into the world, mold brain, which is, it's real, and it impacts us on an emotional basis. It is not well understood, not well appreciated, not looked for. No psychiatrist is going to ask you, have you been in a damp, musty, building, or is there mold in your,
Right, right.
they're not going to ask those questions. But there are a lot of people that are suffering on a psychological basis because there are a lot of water damaged mold buildings in the United States. And so there's a lot of people who are on medications for inflammation due to mold that's not really addressing that root cause. And
Mm,
so it's a kind of a book of advocacy, advocating to the world of pay attention to this. This is real. This is significant.
right. And so that's Mold Brain. And then Chemical Undertow, is it, it's subtitled A Guide to Shame and Repair of Medication-Driven Behaviors. What exactly does that mean?
It means that there are lots of medications out there that can cause adverse psychological
Mm,
responses. There's
hmm.
Parkinson's medications, steroid medications. A big one, and I think it's going to be bigger as we move on in this world, is testosterone. And I'm not anti any of these medications, by the way, but I am for the consent and, in giving people the knowledge to say, sometimes this stuff that like this person acted out of character, this person was cruel, this person was mean, this person was impulsive, they were gambling, they lost all this money, they had an affair, they something happened. And it's kind of like, sometimes it's the medication. Sometimes you should ask, it's kind of like,
Mm,
is a medication at play of being able to understand it? There's been cases where people have been on these Parkinson's medication and they lose their life savings in Vegas. And it's been well documented. There's been lawsuits about it, because it will cause more impulsive kind of behaviors. And so but at the same time, and here's the balance, you can't just say, well, I cheated on you and, I was horrible and all these bad things happened, but it's not my fault. It was the medication. It's kind of like, it may have kind of quote unquote not been your fault, but it sure as heck your responsibility. And it is not, and it's more nuanced in terms of like what you're trying to do, because most of that book is not like it's not like, and it gets talked about many times, it's not this easy out. Oh, you don't have to be responsible, you don't have to feel guilty, you don't have to feel bad about this, because most of the book probably is really about trying to repair those relationships, how to talk to people, how to address it, how to be able to approach it, understanding it from their perspective of what it's like to have dealt with you in those situations. So it's not a get out of jail free card by any means whatsoever, but it is how to repair that, how to talk about it, and how to try to make things better with family, friends, a loved one, as well as trying to make peace with yourself, to have some sort of self forgiveness, to show yourself grace and understanding. Because at the end of the day, it goes back to that word nuanced. It's kind of like you were there, but you weren't there the way that you're normally there because you were chemically altered. I think we see that a little bit more clearly if someone's high on kind of like some illicit drug, or, they're 16 beers deep or something. And it's kind of like, oh, yeah, that person's drunk or that person's high or whatever it may be. But sometimes it's through prescription medication as well, and that these medications can alter us in ways where it was not known that we would be altered in that way. Does that make sense?
100%. And we talked also about earlier The Restless Human, and then what about The Absurd Body is another book that you have.
Well, that goes into kind of like this existentialism of this absurdity. And I love Camus, Albert Camus, and the existentialists of the early 1900s, the French existentialist Sartre, and there may be also be kind of like Heidegger and Albert Camus. And that's what it is, because when we kind of embrace absurdity, and people are like, what's absurdity? And it's like, Steve Martin's old stand-up routine, that's absurdity. And we have like lots of comics, and there's lots of, stuff where it's just like, it's absurd. It doesn't inherently kind of like make sense. Like, I've had pain in my foot for a decade. There is no like rationale on a way that, like, on a human basis of like, well, this is good for our survival for our species. There's no like adaptive reason for
Mm.
chronic pain. But the human brain always wants to like make sense of it. You want to make sense of our existence. We want to make sense of our purpose, our meaning, why I'm feeling this, or why this event happened to me. People do all kinds of things to kind of find that meaning and structure. And sometimes the best way of being able to do it is to blow up all those structures. Now, if someone has a structure that works for them, that's awesome. I'm not here to blow up anyone's structure. But if people are kind of lost in the like, why me? How did this happen? It's kind of like, sometimes it is absurd. Life can be absurd. There sometimes it's the idea that there is no inherent meaning, but the meaning that we put onto the situation, that we have the freedom to assign whatever meaning. So the existentialist, and the thought of existential, especially when it gets into the mental health world, would look at the pillars of freedom, isolation, as well as community, death, and meaning. And so you want to kind of look at it from all those different, vantage points of as you were experiencing the illness. And with existentialism, there's always going to be a lot of talk of freedom, because freedom can be overwhelming. So, because sometimes we can be aware that we are like overly like too free, in some ways, that like we can almost do anything, and there's so many different choices, which isn't always good, because then you'll always kind of second guess and doubt yourself. But it is the dizziness of freedom, and then how isolation, community plays a role, death, mortality plays a role. The story only lasts for so long. And then what a meaning are you assigning to this life, to this, like for my pain? It's like, okay, well, my pain, my illness, well, that's a source of creativity for me. And that is going to be why I am going to create a podcast. I had a primary immune disorder, and I'm going to say that is going to be the driver for my podcast. There is no person out there that says, well, you've got a primary immune disorder, so go start a podcast, because that's what people do when they get primary immune disorders. No one's going to do that. It's my freedom to be able to assign whatever meaning it is ultimately to me. And it can be absurd, because actually the coloring books, absolutely absurd. That I wrote poetry, there's absurdity to that, absolutely absurd. I put my name as like a play on words for the titles. Absurd, absurd. um Even named, and it's like I'm a narcissist, even named, the podcast with my name in there. And like that's absurd. But part of that is a nod to my freedom, that despite the illness, despite the difficulty, despite the pain, despite the fatigue, I still have freedom of choice. I can still pursue things. I can still create things. I can still grow as a human being.
Right. No, I totally get that. And then last book here for now, because you'll probably go write more. The Expanded Life. I think that one is definitely important for everyone who has a chronic illness and is looking for something to read, maybe to help shape their mindset a little bit or see a different approach.
Yeah, it goes back. I've kind of like touched upon the ideas, but when we get that diagnosis, it's kind of feels like it's a series of losses and the
Mm,
world shrinks. It's like we don't feel so good. We don't want to go out to the concert. We don't want to go out with our friends. And, maybe it's hard to keep up with the job, and maybe you're not going to the gym, or you're not exercising or doing those physical activities the same way. And it's like losses, 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 world, shrinks, shrinks. And then you just think like, okay, well, I'm just going to lose everything in my life to this illness. And I'm just going to sit in bed and watch reruns. And I'm saying like, no, you're going to grieve the old self. Okay. The old self is not something that's available to you. And you'll only burn yourself out trying to get back to that old self.
mhm.
But if you allow yourself the grief, and the grief will always return back. You never get rid of grief, completely, because things will come up, and grief will just boomerang back into
Right,
your life.
right,
But through the passage there, you can maintain that curiosity and find other small ways of expanding your life, opening up your window of awareness, and whatever that may be in your own life. It's like I come back, it's like books, podcasts, like that is, opening up the window of awareness. I post stuff on YouTube, which I never had done before. I tried TikTok for 5 minutes, and I post on Threads. I tried Facebook for 10 minutes, and it's kind of like I got curious to see where could I expand. I went to offices marketing, my books, and it's like I had never done any of that stuff. I had never gone to, doctors' offices to market myself that way. Nothing like that had ever, but that was the expansion. That was me trying new and different things. That was just like, where can I grow? And I think about it all the time. I have a friend, and she makes tons of money selling things at a farmer's market. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. I wonder what I could do. And I kind of came up with an idea, but it's kind of like I've been thinking and thinking for months and months and months about it. Whether I do it or not, I may just do like a trial run of, what I want to create. But the idea was, what could I do, and get curious about it? And it's like, oh, I wonder how I could do that. I could ask ChatGPT, I could go to YouTube, I could do all these different things, and I could kind of figure this out. And that would be an area of expansion of like in this part, it's an artistic endeavor, but that's what the book is kind of prompting you. It's kind of like poking you to say, okay, but what about these other areas? What about these other values? What about these other things that weren't just the old self? It is the shedding of skin to find the new person within you. Because, yeah, you have weaknesses, but you probably have strengths that you haven't been using. And this would be the time to learn about them.
right. I agree 100%, especially with the grieving the old life and the things that will come back, but the burnout that can happen and the just the deep loss when you continue to try to chase that. And I think the expansion, like you said, is not always what we expect. And I think creativity is a huge part to leveraging and learning and cultivating the most we can from not just chronic illness, but any hardship in our life, is that
Sure.
opportunity to do that. And so what I want to leave us with is what about working with you one-on-one? You've mentioned that before. Who should really work with you and reach out to you?
Someone that just feels lost in their story. We're all stories. We're celebrating the 4th of July. It's kind of like the story of the nation. And you'll see all of that, in the news, or like it's like the beginning of like football season. There's a story, the pageantry of football. There's stories embedded in our culture everywhere, and we as individuals, we have our own stories, and the illness reshapes and breaks apart the story. And if you're feeling lost in that story, it's not that, it's not just this traditional, I'm depressed, I'm anxious. It's like, I'm confused. I don't know who I am anymore. I'm trying to figure out how I can move forward and how I could expand and how I could handle this. Maybe it's how I deal with a partner or whatever it is, but it's really about the management of a story and the new story of who you are becoming.
Right. And we're going to have your website in the description below for people to check out your podcast, your books, working with you one-on-one, whatever way speaks to them the best. You've got a lot of resources available. And so I think that's amazing, that you've taken what you've gone through and made it into such a platform of resources for people to get help. And I hope this makes, if you're listening and you've had a chronic illness and you felt unseen or unheard, I hope that this episode has touched you in one of those ways, because we know, and I'm sure you can attest to this, that it can be a very isolating and lonely journey, where not a lot of people relate, and people may be somewhat empathetic or try to understand you, but like we said, that deeper understanding is so important. So thank you for making those people heard, and that I'm glad that we have podcasting, that we have these resources available to spread this
Absolutely.
information, to spread these stories, and to reach those people who otherwise would just fade away, and people wouldn't have known why. So I really hope that we're reaching
Absolutely.
people. And so I want to thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and such wonderful, insightful questions. Greatly appreciated it.